The horse was still visible on the long road when Frances turned from the window. She could see the angle of his shoulders, not defeat, not quite, but the particular set of a man who had expected nothing and received precisely that. Mr. Nathaniel Lacey rode the way he had arrived, without ceremony, without complaint, and without looking back. She watched until the road bent behind the elms and the last of him disappeared into the gray April afternoon. Behind her, in the study, her father was already speaking to Palliser about the drainage in the lower field. He had not even waited for Mr. Lacey's horse to clear the gate before returning to the business of the estate. That was the thing about her father. He did not dismiss men with malice. He dismissed them with efficiency. A brief interview, a glass of port he never expected the man to finish, and a handshake that contained within it the entire architecture of refusal. He was invariably polite. He was never unkind. And in 23 years of raising her alone, he had never once asked Frances whom she might prefer. She had counted them. Not at first. At first they had seemed distant, theoretical, men who came to the house with interests she did not fully understand and left with expressions she could not yet read. But from her 19th year she had kept a quiet tally, not on paper, but in the part of her mind that catalogued things her father did not know she noticed, 11 suitors in 4 years. Mr. Lacey was the 11th. The first had been Sir Philip Oakes, who was 46 and spoke exclusively about his kennels. Her father had refused him on grounds of temperament, which Frances thought generous. The second was Mr. George Haddon, whose family held land in Wiltshire. Good land, good name, good teeth. Her father found his education wanting. The third was Lord Selby's youngest son, who had no title and no prospects, but who made Frances laugh at the Ashford Assembly until her sides ached. Her father said the boy had no situation and could not keep her. The fourth, fifth, and sixth blurred together now. Suitable men with suitable incomes whom her father had weighed and found, in each case, insufficient. By the seventh, Mr. Alistair Fenn, a clergyman's son with steady hands and a calm way of listening. Frances had begun to understand that the fault was not in the suitors. The fault was in the question her father was answering. He was not asking whether any of these men could make her happy. He was asking whether any of them could replace him, and because no one could, no one passed. She had not said this aloud. She was not, by nature, someone who said difficult things aloud. She had inherited from her mother, so Mrs. Ord told her in the housekeeper's careful way of keeping Agnes Drayton alive through small domestic observations, a preference for watching over speaking, for understanding a room before attempting to change it. Her father called this quality composure. He admired it. He did not realize it was also the quality that allowed her to see him clearly, to observe the machinery of his control without being caught in its gears. Until now. Mr. Lacey had been different, not louder, not grander, not more obviously distinguished than the others. He was the second son of a baronet with a modest living in Hertfordshire and an education from Cambridge that he wore lightly. He had come to Selborne Park 3 times, once for dinner, once for a shooting party at which he had proved a moderate shot and an excellent conversationalist, and once, 6 weeks ago, to walk with Frances along the south terrace while her father observed from the library window. That walk had lasted 40 minutes. Frances knew because she had heard the mantel clock strike when they returned. In 40 minutes, Mr. Lacey had asked her about the glass house. She was rebuilding the one her mother had let fall into disrepair, a project her father tolerated but did not understand, and had listened to her answer with the kind of attention that made her feel, for the first time in years, that her words were arriving somewhere. He did not interrupt. He did not redirect. When she mentioned that the particular strain of damask rose she was attempting to propagate had been her mother's favorite, he had simply nodded and said, "I should very much like to see it when it blooms, if I may. If I may." No one had ever asked her permission for anything. She had known then, with the quiet certainty she brought to all her recognitions, that Nathaniel Lacey was the man she would have chosen. Not because he was the best of them, though he may have been, because he was the first who had seen her as someone whose choices mattered. And her father had sent him away in 11 minutes. She had heard the study door close at 2:30. By 18 minutes to 3, Mr. Lacey's horse was being brought round. She had not needed to ask what was said. Her father's reasons would have been specific, rational, and utterly beside the point. Too modest an income, too little standing, too far from Selborne. He would have offered the handshake and the unfinished port, and Mr. Lacey, who was not the sort of man to make a scene, would have understood and gone. Frances stood at the window for a long time after the road was empty. That evening, she did not come down to dinner. Her father sent word through Mrs. Ord, who climbed the stairs with the careful tread of a woman who had served this house for 31 years and understood its silences better than most understood conversation. Mrs. Ord knocked, entered, and found Frances sitting at her writing desk with a letter half composed. "You are not unwell," Mrs. Ord said. It was not a question. "No," Frances said, "I am not unwell." Mrs. Ord looked at the letter, then at Frances, then at the door she had come through, which led down the corridor to the staircase, which led down to the dining room, where the Duke of Selborne was sitting alone with 2 place settings and a tureen of soup growing cold. She said nothing more. She had learned over 3 decades that the women of this house communicated in what they did not say, and that the appropriate response was usually to wait. Frances finished her letter that night. It was addressed to her aunt, her mother's sister, Mrs. Cecily Hargrove, who kept a house in Bath, and who had, on more than one occasion, suggested that Frances might benefit from a season away from Selborne. Her father had always declined on her behalf. Frances had never questioned it. She questioned it now. The letter requested 3 things: a room, an indefinite stay, and discretion. She did not ask her aunt to keep the arrangement secret from her father. She simply asked that the invitation, when it came, be addressed to Frances directly, not to the Duke, not to the household, to her. She posted it herself the following morning, walking to the village before breakfast, while her father was still with his steward, reviewing the quarter's accounts. She took the path through the kitchen garden rather than the main drive, not because she was hiding, she was not, but because she wanted the walk, the cold air, the feeling of her boots on gravel that did not belong to anyone but the road. Mrs. Ord saw her return, said nothing, set a fresh pot of chocolate in the morning room, and closed the door behind her. The reply from Bath arrived 4 days later. Frances intercepted it from the Morning Post, not surreptitiously, but simply because she was the first to the salver, as she had arranged to be. Her aunt's letter was warm, immediate, and unsurprised. The room was ready. Frances could come whenever she wished and stay as long as she needed. She began packing that afternoon. Not everything, not her mother's cedar chest, not the watercolors from the nursery, not the books her father had given her on her birthdays, each one inscribed in his careful hand. She packed her own things, her dresses, her journals, her correspondence, her drawing materials, the pressed flowers from the glass house. She packed the way she did everything, methodically, completely, without haste and without hesitation. It took her father 2 days to notice, not because he was inattentive in the usual sense. Hugh Drayton was, in fact, an extraordinarily observant man when it came to his estate, his tenants, his accounts, and the condition of his horses. He could tell at a glance whether a fence had been mended properly or a field drained to the correct grade. But his daughter's rooms were upstairs, and he had never been the sort of father who entered them uninvited. He respected her privacy. He simply did not realize that privacy and distance were, in this case, the same thing. It was Mrs. Ord who told him in the end. Not directly. Mrs. Ord was not direct about anything that involved the hearts of the family she served. She mentioned, while reviewing the week's linen orders, that Miss Drayton's rooms would require fewer fires shortly, as she understood Miss Drayton would be traveling. Traveling, Hugh said. The word seemed to perplex him, as though his daughter were a piece of furniture that had announced its intention to relocate. To Bath, Mrs. Ord said, to stay with Mrs. Hargrove. Hugh set down his pen. For how long? Mrs. Ord folded her hands. I believe Miss Drayton said she would write once she was settled. There was a quality to Hugh Drayton's stillness that Frances had inherited. When something struck him, truly struck him, past the competent surface and into the part of himself he kept private, he did not react. He went very quiet, and the quietness had a weight to it that filled the room. Mrs. Ord had seen it only twice before, once when the physician had come downstairs after Agnes died, and once when Frances, aged 7, had fallen from the orchard wall and lain motionless on the grass for 4 seconds that had lasted, for her father, approximately a lifetime. He found Frances in the glass house. She was wrapping the base of a young rose, cutting in damp muslin, preparing it for transport. The glass house was cold, the stove had not been lit, and her breath made small clouds in the afternoon light that came through the old panes in fractured greenish columns. You are leaving, he said. She did not look up from the cutting. "I am," she said, "to Bath, to Aunt Cecily's." He stood in the doorway. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with gray at his temples that had arrived in the year after Agnes and never retreated. He looked, Francis thought, exactly as he looked when he stood in the doorway of his study to dismiss a suitor, composed, certain, entirely in command of the situation, except that he was not in command of this one, and she could see in the way his hand rested on the doorframe that he was beginning to understand it. "I was not consulted," he said. Frances set the cutting down. She looked at him then, fully, steadily, with the gray eyes she had from her mother and the directness she had from him. "No," she said, "you were not." The silence between them was not hostile. It was the silence of two people who had lived in the same house for 23 years and loved each other deeply and failed each other in ways that only people who love deeply can manage. "Frances," he said. "If this is about Mr. Lacey, it is about every one of them," she said. Her voice was level, unhurried, entirely without heat. 11 men in 4 years, Papa. You refused everyone. You did not ask me about a single one. And I allowed it, because I trusted that you were protecting me. But you were not protecting me. You were keeping me." The word landed between them like a stone in still water. Hugh opened his mouth, closed it. He was not accustomed to being without words. He was a man of the House of Lords, fluent in debate, comfortable with disagreement, skilled at holding a position under pressure. But this was not the House of Lords. This was his daughter, standing among her mother's roses with her bags packed upstairs, telling him something he had known and not known for years. "I will not be managed any longer," she said. "You may keep your house, Papa, but you may not keep me." She picked up the rose cutting and wrapped it in her handkerchief, and she did not say anything else, and she waited. He left the glass house without answering. She heard his boots on the gravel path, then on the flagstones, then nothing. The door to his study closed. She could hear it from here, which meant he had closed it harder than he intended. She stood among the roses and breathed and felt the cold air fill her lungs and thought, that is the sound of a man who has just discovered that the door he built to protect someone has become the wall that separates them. She left for Bath the following Tuesday. Her father did not come downstairs to see her off. Mrs. Ord stood at the front door with a parcel, shortbread, a jar of damson preserve from last autumn's batch, and a pair of gloves that had been Agnes's, which Mrs. Ord had kept in tissue paper in the linen cupboard for 20 years, waiting, she said, for the right moment. Frances held the gloves for a long time before she put them in her traveling case. The carriage had been ordered by Palliser, who had received his instructions from Mrs. Ord, who had received no instructions from anyone, but who understood that when a young woman of this house decided to leave, the house would ensure she left properly. The horses were good. The coachman was reliable. The road to Bath was long but dry. Frances did not look back at the house as the carriage pulled away. She had spent 23 years looking at it. She knew every window, every chimney, every crack in the south facade where the wisteria had worked its way into the stone. She did not need to look. She needed to leave. Hugh Drayton spent the first week telling himself she would return within a fortnight. Young women had moods, even sensible ones, and Frances was the most sensible creature he had ever known, excepting her mother, occasionally needed distance before they saw reason. By the second week, he had stopped telling himself this. Her letters arrived regularly, addressed to Mrs. Ord, not to him, which was the detail that told him everything he needed to know about the depth of what had happened. She wrote about Bath with a kind of surprised contentment that he found more alarming than anger would have been. She was attending concerts. She was visiting the lending library. She was walking the Crescent with her aunt and taking tea with women whose names he did not recognize. She was building a life that did not include him, and she was doing it with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. The house noticed her absence before he did. Or rather, the house made her absence legible in ways that Hugh could not avoid. The pianoforte in the drawing room stood closed. No one opened it. The glass house, which had been warm and tended and full of the green industry of propagation, went cold within a week. Palliser asked whether the gardener should continue watering, and Hugh said yes, and then forgot to confirm it, and the gardener, receiving no clear instruction, watered cautiously, and several of the cuttings died. The morning room, where Frances had taken her breakfast since she was 15, retained the particular quality of a room that has been occupied by the same person for so long that their absence is a kind of presence. The chair at the angle she preferred, the book she had been reading still open on the side table, a pressed leaf she had used as a marker slipping slowly toward the floor. He took his meals in the dining room, alone, at the head of a table built for 14. Mrs. Ord set his place with the same care she had always shown, but she said only one, and the sound of a single fork on porcelain in a room that size had a quality Hugh found difficult to name and impossible to ignore. He occupied himself. He was a man of considerable resources. The estate demanded attention. The House of Lords was sitting. His correspondence with his solicitor regarding the northern properties required answers. He rode out most mornings to inspect the farms. He attended to the business of the county. He did everything he had always done, in the same order, with the same precision, and none of it filled the space that Francis had left. It was Mrs. Ord, finally, who said the thing that no one else in the household would have dared to say. She said it while bringing his evening tea, setting the tray on the desk with the precision of long practice, and she said it without looking at him, which was her way of saying things that mattered. The Duchess would not have let it go on this long, she said. Mrs. Drayton would have told you 5 years ago. Hugh stared at the tea. Agnes, he said. She would have said you were holding too tight, Mrs. Ord continued. She would have said it kindly because she was kind, but she would have said it clearly because she was also clear, and you would have listened because you listened to her. She left the room. Hugh sat with his tea cooling and the fire dying, and the portrait of Agnes above the mantel, painted the year before Francis was born, when Agnes had been 24, and had looked at the painter with exactly the expression Francis had given him in the glass house. Steady, direct, certain of what she saw, and unwilling to pretend otherwise. He had married Agnes Hargrove because she was the only woman he had ever met who did not rearrange herself in his presence. She had not deferred, had not flattered, had not softened her opinions to suit his comfort. She had been entirely, immovably, magnificently herself, and he had loved her for it with a completeness that had left him, when she died, not broken but emptied, a house with all its rooms intact and nothing living in any of them. Except Francis. And he had loved Francis the way a man loves the only thing left of the woman he lost, ferociously, totally, with a grip that did not know how to loosen because loosening felt like losing, and he had lost enough. Every suitor who came to the door was not a man offering his daughter happiness. Every suitor was a threat. Every suitor was the possibility that the last room in the empty house would go dark. He understood this now, not because Mrs. Ord had said it, though Mrs. Ord had said it well. He understood it because Francis had left, and in leaving she had shown him the shape of what his love had become, not a shelter, but a cage, built with the best materials and the finest intentions, and locked from the outside by a man who had convinced himself he was standing guard. He wrote to Mr. Lacy on a Thursday. It was the most difficult letter he had ever composed, and he had composed letters to the Lord Chancellor, to 3 separate prime ministers, and to the physician who had attended Agnes in her final hours. Those letters had been affairs of precision and protocol. This one required something he had not practiced in years, honesty without authority. He did not apologize. He was not, even now, a man who apologized easily. But he wrote with a frankness that surprised him, explaining, without excusing, what he had done and why, and acknowledging, without qualification, that his reasons had been his own and not his daughter's. He wrote that Frances was in Bath with her aunt. He wrote that he had no right to suggest what Mr. Lacy should do with this information. He wrote that if Mr. Lacy chose to call upon her, he would not find the Duke of Selborne standing in the way. He sealed the letter and posted it himself. Walking to the village in the early morning, taking the path through the kitchen garden, the same path, though he did not know it, that Francis had taken weeks before. Nathaniel Lacy received the letter on a Saturday. He read it twice, put on his good coat, and left for Bath the same afternoon. Frances saw him from the window of her aunt's drawing room 3 days later. He was standing on the pavement below, looking up at the house with the expression of a man who was not certain he was welcome, but who had decided that uncertainty was not a sufficient reason to stay away. He was holding his hat in both hands. His coat was creased from travel. He looked, Frances thought, exactly as he had looked walking beside her on the south terrace, attentive, unhurried, present. She went downstairs and opened the door herself. Her aunt's maid was behind her, startled. It was not customary for the niece of the house to answer the door, but Frances did not wait for custom. "Mr. Lacey," she said. "Miss Drayton," he said. He paused. "I received a letter from your father." She looked at him. The street was quiet. A carriage passed on the far side of the crescent. Somewhere inside the house, her aunt was pretending not to watch from the first-floor window. "What did it say?" Frances asked. "It said I might call upon you," he said, "if you would allow it." There it was again. If. The conditional that undid her. Not because it was tentative. Mr. Lacey was not a tentative man, but because it contained within it the assumption that her answer mattered, that she was not a door to be walked through, but a person to be asked. "You may," she said. He came to tea that afternoon, and the following day, and the day after that. Her aunt chaperoned with the cheerful negligence of a woman who had decided, approximately 40 seconds after meeting Mr. Lacey, that he was precisely right. He brought flowers once, not hothouse flowers, not expensive ones, but wild ones from the hedgerow outside Bath, because Frances had mentioned on the terrace that she preferred them. She put them in a jar on her writing desk, and they lasted a week. They walked the crescent together in the mornings, with her aunt trailing at a distance that was technically proper and practically useless. They discussed books. He had read more widely than his modest manner suggested, and he had opinions about Cowper that made Frances laugh, which was not something she did often, and which, when she did it, changed her face entirely. They discussed the glass house. They discussed his living in Hertfordshire, the house that needed work, the garden that needed vision, the parish that was small and quiet and full of people who had known his family for 3 generations. He spoke about it not with ambition, but with affection, the way a man speaks about a place he has chosen rather than inherited, and Frances heard in his voice the particular steadiness of someone who understood that a life could be built from modest materials if the builder was willing to stay. He did not ask about her father, not once. He understood, with the same instinct that had made him ask if I may on the terrace, that the subject was hers to raise, and that raising it was not the same as resolving it, and that both of these things would happen in their own time. He proposed on a Wednesday, in her aunt's garden, beside a rose bush that was not half so fine as the ones at Selborne, but that had the advantage of not belonging to her father. Frances wrote to Hugh that evening. The letter was short, and she addressed it to him, not to Mrs. Ord, not to the household. To him. He replied within 2 days. The letter contained 3 sentences. The first said he was glad. The second said he hoped she would allow him to attend the wedding. The third said he missed her, and that the glass house was not the same. He did not say he was proud of her, or that he approved of Mr. Lacey, or that he wished he had done things differently. He said what he could manage, and to Frances, who had spent 23 years reading the spaces between her father's words, understood that the 3 sentences contained all of these things, pressed down and folded tight, in the way of a man who had spent a lifetime being articulate about everything, except what mattered most. The wedding took place in June, in the chapel at Selborne Park, which had not been decorated with flowers since Agnes's funeral 20 years earlier. It had been Frances's choice to marry here, not in Bath, not in Hertfordshire, but in the house she had left, in the chapel where her parents had married, as though returning for the ceremony was itself a kind of statement. She was not running from Selborne. She was leaving it properly, through the front door, with witnesses. Mrs. Ord oversaw the arrangements, white roses from the glass house, the very strain Frances had been propagating from her mother's cuttings. They lined the aisle and filled the window ledges, and their scent carried through the open doors into the June morning, so that later, when people spoke of the wedding, they mentioned the roses first. The pews held neighbors, tenants, a handful of families from the county who had known Hugh and Agnes and who now watched their daughter walk the same aisle her mother had walked, in a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Ord had pressed that morning with the same iron she had used on Agnes's wedding dress a quarter-century before. Hugh walked his daughter down the aisle. He did it slowly, not because he was reluctant, though part of him was, but because he wanted to remember it. The weight of her hand on his arm, the sound of her dress on the stone floor, the way the light came through the east window and caught the side of her face, which was Agnes's face, which was also entirely her own. Halfway down the aisle, Frances's hand tightened on his arm, not nervously, not with hesitation, but with the brief pressure of someone acknowledging a shared history. He covered her fingers with his own. It was the most they had said to each other in months, and neither of them spoke a word. At the altar, he placed her hand in Mr. Lacey's. He looked at the young man, who was not, Hugh admitted, young, being 31 and steady and already showing the kind of constancy that would wear well over decades, and he saw what Francis had seen: a man who asked permission, a man who understood that love was not something you held but something you offered with open hands and trusted the other person to take. He sat down in the front pew and wept once, silently, the way men of his generation wept. A single contraction of the face, a breath held and released, a hand pressed briefly to the bridge of the nose. Mrs. Ord, sitting 3 rows behind, saw it. She did not look away, but she did not intrude. She folded her hands in her lap and allowed the Duke of Selborne the privacy of his grief, which was also his pride, which was also his letting go. The Laceys settled in Hertfordshire, on Nathaniel's modest estate, which Frances proceeded to transform with the same methodical attention she had given the glass house at Selborne. The gardens were replanted, the house was aired, brightened, opened. She hired a steward, a quiet man named Dunbar, who reminded her, though she did not say so, of Palliser, and she oversaw the household through him with a competence that surprised no one who had known her mother. Hugh visited at Michaelmas. He came alone, in his own carriage, and he arrived without announcement because he was still, in some ways, a man accustomed to being expected. Frances met him at the door. She was wearing a dress he did not recognize, something she had bought in Bath, or perhaps had made, and her hair was arranged differently, and there was a quality to the way she stood in the doorway of her own house that made him understand, fully and finally, that she was no longer his. She had not stopped being his daughter, she had stopped being his possession. The distinction, which would have bewildered him a year ago, was perfectly clear to him now. They walked the garden together. She showed him the roses, the same damask strain, propagated from cuttings she had brought from Selborne, blooming now in Hertfordshire soil as though they had always been here. They talked about drainage and tenants and the price of wool, and eventually, because they were both people who arrived at important things sideways, they talked about Agnes. She would have liked him, Frances said, meaning Nathaniel. Hugh looked at the roses. Yes, he said. She would have liked him very much, and she would have told me so, and I would not have listened, and she would have made me listen anyway. Frances smiled. It was the first time she had smiled at her father since the glass house, and he felt it the way a man feels the first warm day after a long winter, not with relief exactly, but with the sudden awareness of how cold he had been. Their first child was born the following spring, a girl whom Frances named Agnes without asking anyone's opinion, because she was her mother's daughter, in this as in everything. Hugh held his granddaughter in the drawing-room of the Hertfordshire house and looked at the small face, which was Frances's face, which was Agnes's face, and understood that this was what letting go looked like. Not an ending, but a widening. Not a loss, but a door opened into a room he had not known existed. He visited 4 times a year after that. He brought shortbread from Mrs. Ord, who baked it herself and packed it in the same kind of parcel she had given Frances the morning she left. He brought books for the child, inscribed in his careful hand, the same hand that had inscribed Frances's birthday books, each one a small act of permanence against the passage of time. He brought once a cutting from the original damask rose at Selborne, the mother plant, the one Agnes had put in the ground the year they married, and Frances planted it by the front gate where it would be the first thing visitors saw. A second child followed, a boy whom Nathaniel named after his own father, and Hugh accepted without comment, understanding that the naming of children was no longer his province and never should have been. The boy had Hugh's build and Frances's eyes, and a laugh that sounded, Mrs. Ord said on one of her rare visits to Hertfordshire, exactly like the late Duchess, a claim that could not be verified, but that no one, least of all Hugh, wished to dispute. Nathaniel watched his wife and her father from the doorway of his own study sometimes, the way they walked the garden together, the way their silences matched, the way Frances's hand occasionally found her father's arm and rested there, briefly, before withdrawing. He did not interrupt these moments. He understood that reconciliation was not a single act, but a practice, and that the two of them were practicing. On the evening of one such visit, after Hugh had gone up to bed and the house was quiet, Frances sat at her writing desk and opened the drawer where she kept her correspondence. Beneath the letters, from her aunt, from Mrs. Ord, from the friends she had made in Bath, there was a single sheet of paper, folded small. her father's letter to Nathaniel. She had asked for it once, early in their marriage, and Nathaniel had given it without question. She did not read it often. She did not need to, but she kept it, because it was the only letter her father had ever written that said, in his careful, formal, inadequate hand, what he could not say aloud, that he had been wrong, and that he was sorry, and that his daughter's happiness mattered more than his fear. She closed the drawer and went upstairs to the room where her daughter was sleeping, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the small shape in the cot, and she thought about what it meant to love someone enough to let them choose, not the easy way, not all at once, but slowly, imperfectly, with the kind of courage that looked from the outside like nothing at all. The candle on the landing guttered in the draught from the stairwell. The house settled around her. Somewhere in Hertfordshire, the roses were closing for the night, and at Selborne Park, 30 miles north, the glass house stood empty and bright under a quarter moon, its panes still intact, its door still unlocked, waiting, as it always had, for someone to return. They arrive here, like a hand finally unclenched and offered, whenever they are ready.